The air trembled before the first shell even landed. It wasn't just sound. It was a feeling that crawled beneath the skin, vibrating through the bones of men who had already forgotten what silence felt like. On that gray morning, the world seemed to hold its breath as thousands of soldiers stood in their trenches, waiting. Mud clung to their boots, rain whispered on steel helmets, and every heartbeat felt like a countdown to chaos. Somewhere in the distance, a radio cracked to life, a faint voice drowned by the hum of engines and the distant echo of marching boots. The war was moving closer. They said the front lines were shifting, that this battle would change everything. But on the ground, the soldiers didn't care about maps or strategies. They cared about survival, about making it through one more sunrise. Each man carried more than a rifle. He carried memories of home, of faces fading from his mind with every explosion. Letters tucked inside torn jackets, promises scribbled in haste, and hope buried under the smell of gunpowder. That's what kept them breathing. As the orders came through, the quiet dissolved into thunder. Artillery roared, smoke devoured the horizon, and the sky turned black with ash. The earth shook so violently that it felt alive, as if the planet itself was protesting the madness of mankind. Men shouted through the haze, not out of courage, but out of fear that silence might mean they were next. Every step forward felt like walking into the mouth of death, yet they moved, not for glory, not for flags, but because turning back meant betrayal to those who had already fallen. In that chaos, moments of haunting beauty still appeared. A soldier helped his wounded comrade crawl through fire. Another paused to whisper a prayer over an enemy's body. Humanity flickered like candlelight in a storm, fragile, trembling, but not yet extinguished. And amid the madness, a strange realization grew. Wars are never truly fought by nations or ideologies. They're fought by individuals, hearts that once dreamed of peace, now trapped in a nightmare built by others. Night fell, and the battlefield glowed with the dull red of burning machines. The cries of the injured echoed through the ruins, mingling with the crackle of distant flames. Somewhere among the wreckage, a young soldier clutched a photograph, his hands shaking, eyes fixed on a future he knew might never come. He wasn't thinking about victory. He was thinking about the sound of laughter he'd left behind, about how fragile the world could be when men decided to play gods. Above him, the stars hid behind smoke, as if ashamed to witness what humanity had become. The ground beneath was no longer soil. It was memory, soaked in sacrifice and silence. For every bullet fired, a dream was lost. For every flag raised, 1,000 tears fell unnoticed. And yet, the war continued, indifferent to the cries of those who fed its hunger. In that moment, as the wind carried the scent of ashes, one truth stood tall. This was not just a battle for land or power. It was a battle for meaning, for the last pieces of the human soul struggling to survive in a world consumed by chaos. And somewhere in the dark, among the whispers of the dying, a new resolve was born, not to win the war, but to remember why it should never have begun. Dawn came quietly, but it brought no peace. The sky was pale and cold, stretched thin over a landscape that no longer looked like Earth. Smoke rose in ghostly columns, twisting into the morning air, carrying with it the smell of oil, blood, and burnt hope. The battlefield was silent in the way cemeteries are silent. Heavy, suffocating, waiting for the next scream to break it. From the trenches, faces emerged, young, hollow, and covered in ash. Their eyes spoke more than their lips ever could. They had seen things that words could never carry, things that stripped away everything human from them. Yet, they walked, because walking was all they could still do. Some leaned on rifles like crutches, others dragged their feet through mud thick with the past. No one asked where they were going, because no one really knew. Orders were just noise now, distant, distorted commands floating through shattered radios. A commander stood on the ridge, his coat torn, his expression unreadable. He had once believed in victory, in the promise that every loss meant something. But now, as he looked upon the ruins below, he saw only patterns of destruction repeating endlessly, each side claiming righteousness, each side bleeding the same. He lit a cigarette with shaking hands, the flame flickering like a dying star, and for a moment, the war seemed almost quiet. Then the gunfire began again. In the chaos that followed, lines blurred. Friend and foe became indistinguishable in the smoke. A young soldier found himself face to face with an enemy barely older than him, both trembling, both terrified. They froze, staring at each other, mirrors of fear. One moved first, not out of hatred, but out of instinct, and when it was over, silence returned, heavier than before. The soldier fell to his knees, the gun slipping from his grasp. He hadn't won. He had simply survived, and survival didn't feel like victory anymore. Further down the ravaged valley, medics moved like shadows among the wounded. Their hands were stained, their hearts numb. They whispered comfort to dying men who couldn't hear them, holding them until breath turned to stillness. Each life saved felt like defiance. Each one lost felt like a promise broken. And yet they kept going, driven by something beyond duty, perhaps guilt, perhaps the desperate hope that even in hell, kindness still mattered. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the smoldering horizon, the world turned golden for just a moment, a cruel illusion of peace. Birds circled above the ruins, as if confused by what the humans below had done to themselves. A soldier looked up and wondered if the sky pitied them, or if it had simply stopped caring. Around him, the ground was littered with fragments of metal and memory, helmets, letters, half-burnt photographs, remnants of lives that once believed in forever. The sound of an accordion drifted faintly through the smoke, someone playing in the distance, maybe out of madness, maybe out of longing. It was a haunting melody, fragile but alive, cutting through the gunfire like a heartbeat refusing to stop. For a brief second, men paused. Even the wind seemed to listen. The music reminded them of home, of mothers waiting, of laughter that had no place here. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. Silence returned, but it wasn't the same silence. It carried memory now. That night, as the campfires flickered weakly, one soldier wrote in his notebook, not about war, but about what he missed. The warmth of sunlight through curtains, the smell of rain, the sound of children running through fields. He wrote as if his words might outlive the madness around him. Maybe that's what war truly is, a place where people fight not just for land, but for fragments of what it means to be human. The final days of the war arrived like ghosts, silent at first, then impossible to ignore. The gunfire that once shook the earth had grown sporadic, uncertain, as if even the weapons were exhausted. Smoke still clung to the horizon, but beneath it, something unfamiliar began to stir. It wasn't victory, not yet. It was the fragile scent of an ending. Soldiers looked around, confused by the sudden quiet, their ears still ringing from years of thunder. The war had taken so much that peace felt almost unreal, like a dream they no longer knew how to believe in. In the ruins of what was once a city, a small group of survivors gathered near a crumbling wall. They spoke in whispers, their voices hoarse from shouting over explosions that had finally stopped. No one cheered. There was no energy left for celebration. Instead, they stared at the ground, at the boots that had marched over too many graves, at the hands that still trembled when they touched their rifles. For the first time in years, they could hear the wind again. It sounded strange, almost wrong, because it wasn't carrying screams anymore. A medic walked through the rubble, his uniform stained and his eyes hollow. He stopped beside a child, the only living soul in what had been a neighborhood. The child said nothing, just looked up, waiting for someone to explain what had happened. But how do you explain to a child that the world destroyed itself for reasons even adults could no longer remember? The medic knelt, offering a ration bar and a weak smile. It was the smallest act of kindness, but in that moment, it felt like rebuilding the universe. Elsewhere, the commanders gathered around makeshift tables covered with torn maps. Lines drawn in ink now looked meaningless, soaked in the blood of millions. They spoke of treaties, borders, reparations, words meant to bring order to chaos. But beneath their calm voices was the weight of guilt, the unspoken understanding that even when peace was declared, the echoes of war would never truly fade. Every decision they made would haunt generations that hadn't yet been born. As the sun set over the battlefield for the last time, its light fell upon the wreckage, twisted tanks, shattered helmets, letters that would never reach home. The colors were strangely beautiful, the kind of beauty that only comes when everything has been broken. A soldier stood there, watching the light stretch across the land, and whispered to no one in particular, "We survived, but what did we save?" The words dissolved into the wind, but they stayed, somewhere deep in the soil, in the silence between heartbeats. Days turned into weeks, and the world tried to remember how to breathe again. Cities began to rebuild, flags were raised, and parades marched through streets still lined with scars. But behind every cheer was a shadow, the memory of what had been lost. Mothers searched for sons who would never return. Veterans sat in silence, staring at the horizon as if waiting for ghosts. The war was over, but the peace it left behind was fragile, trembling like a candle in a storm. Years later, the stories of that war would be told again and again, in classrooms, in books, in documentaries. But the truth would always remain deeper than any archive could hold. It lived in the eyes of those who saw it, in the nightmares that came long after the world moved on. And yet, within that sorrow, there was something sacred, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, humanity still searched for light. Because war, for all its destruction, cannot erase the human will to feel, to hope, to remember, to rebuild. The silence that followed wasn't just the end of gunfire. It was the beginning of understanding. And as the first flowers began to grow where soldiers had once fallen, the earth itself seemed to whisper what humanity had almost forgotten. Peace is not the absence of war. It is the courage to never start one again.